At 08:15 hours on May 7, 1943, British armored units rolled into Tunis, Tunisia, marking the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa. American forces captured Bizerte the same day. Within hours, German soldiers throughout Tunisia began surrendering in groups ranging from dozens to entire battalions. Over the next 6 days, 267,000 Axis troops would lay down their arms in the largest surrender of the North African campaign. Among the equipment German soldiers observed during those final chaotic days were vehicles that had become ubiquitous across every American position. Small, open-topped four-wheeled machines that moved with a capability unlike anything the Wehrmacht possessed. These American vehicles, barely larger than motorcycles with wheels, were climbing terrain that would stop a Kuba wagon cold. They were carrying soldiers and equipment, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for their size, and they were everywhere. For every German vehicle on Tunisian roads, there appeared to be 10 of these American machines. The vehicle was the Willys MB, a quarter-ton four-wheel drive truck that American soldiers called a Jeep. It weighed 1,113 kilograms empty, measured 131 inches long, stood 69.8 inches high with the canvas top up. It had an 80-inch wheelbase and seated 5 soldiers when packed tight. Under the hood sat a 134.2 cubic inch inline four-cylinder engine that soldiers called the Go Devil. It produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 105 foot-pounds of torque at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The top speed on good roads was 65 miles per hour. The fuel tank held 15 gallons, giving it a range of approximately 300 miles on highway conditions. The specifications told part of the story, but they did not explain what made German soldiers covet this vehicle above everything else in the American arsenal. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang, not the B-17 Flying Fortress. Wehrmacht generals, when interviewed after their surrender by United States Army historian Hugh Cole, stated that they admired the Jeep more than any other piece of American equipment. German troops called it the Wonder Wagon. They captured them whenever possible, repainted them with German markings, and used them until they broke down or ran out of fuel. The pattern of German fascination with captured Jeeps began as early as January 1943, when Afrika Korps reconnaissance units first encountered abandoned American vehicles near the Tunisian front lines. German intelligence officers compiled detailed technical assessments. Reports documented every aspect of Jeep design: the four-wheel drive system with a 2-speed transfer case, the 3-speed manual transmission, the simple but rugged suspension, the fold-down windshield that could be laid flat on the hood, the removable canvas top and doors. What caught German attention was not just the mechanical components, but the underlying concept. The Jeep was designed as a light reconnaissance and utility vehicle, similar in purpose to the German Kuba wagon. But where the Kuba wagon relied on lightweight and a simple air-cooled rear engine to achieve mobility, the Jeep used raw mechanical capability. Four-wheel drive where the Kuba wagon had 2. 60 horsepower where the Kuba wagon had 23.5. Selectable high and low-range gearing that let it climb obstacles or tow loads far beyond what its size suggested possible. German field tests of captured Jeeps revealed performance that exceeded expectations. The vehicles handled sand, rocks, and slopes that would stop a Kuba wagon. The steering was direct and responsive. The engine never hesitated. The brakes were strong. Most importantly, the Jeep could be repaired with basic tools. The engine was simple, accessible, designed for field maintenance by soldiers with minimal training. Every component was overbuilt, designed to survive abuse. German intelligence reports from Tunisia consistently concluded with similar assessments. The American Jeep is superior to all German light vehicles in every measurable category except fuel consumption. It is faster, more powerful, more capable in rough terrain, and more reliable under combat conditions. Multiple reports recommended immediate acquisition of intact examples for detailed engineering analysis and tactical deployment. But these recommendations came too late for the Afrika Korps. By March 1943, German forces in North Africa were fighting for survival. The British Eighth Army pushed from the east, American forces from the west. German fuel supplies had been reduced to a trickle by Allied air and naval attacks on Mediterranean shipping. At the Battle of Madanin on March 6, 1943, German forces lost 50 tanks in a failed counterattack. Vehicle performance comparisons were irrelevant when there was no fuel to run any vehicles and no prospect of reinforcement. The few Jeeps that German units managed to capture and keep operational became prized possessions. Logistics officers used them to shuttle supplies from rear areas to forward positions. Company commanders used them for rapid movement between positions. Forward observers used them to reach vantage points that would have taken hours to reach on foot.
Medical personnel used them to evacuate wounded soldiers from forward areas. The Jeeps were not replacing tanks or half-tracks. They were filling roles that German doctrine had not adequately addressed. The gap between individual soldiers on foot and heavy vehicles. German tactical reports from Tunisia noted a critical observation. The Jeep allowed American commanders to make decisions and implement them immediately. In the fluid fighting of North Africa, where battles shifted by the hour and communication lines were constantly disrupted, the ability to move commanders and staff officers rapidly between positions was crucial. The Jeep made that possible in ways German vehicles did not. By the time Tunisia fell in May 1943, German intelligence had compiled dozens of separate reports on captured American Jeeps. The reports came from every level of command, from individual soldiers to division commanders. The conclusion was unanimous. The Jeep was the most effective light military vehicle any German officer had encountered, superior to German equivalents in virtually every measurable category. But what made the Jeep truly remarkable was not any single technical feature. It was the philosophical difference it represented. German military vehicles were designed as specialized tools. The Kubovar was a reconnaissance vehicle. The Opel Blitz was a cargo truck. The half-track was a troop carrier. Each vehicle had a specific role and was optimized for that role. The Jeep was designed as a universal tool. It could perform any light vehicle role adequately well. Reconnaissance, transport, cargo hauling, ambulance, communication, command and control. The vehicle itself was less important than the concept behind it. This was what Wehrmacht generals meant when they said they admired the Jeep more than any other American weapon. It represented a fundamentally different approach to military logistics. The Americans had figured out that having one vehicle that could do 10 things adequately well was more valuable than having 10 specialized vehicles that could each do one thing perfectly, especially when that one vehicle could be mass-produced in quantities that made individual losses irrelevant. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys produced 363,000 Jeeps and Ford produced 280,000, a total of 643,000 vehicles delivered at a unit cost of $649 each. By comparison, Germany produced approximately 50,435 Kubovar wagons during the entire war at a unit cost roughly 3 times higher when adjusted for production scale. The numbers told the real story. The Americans were not just better at designing vehicles, they were better at building them. Industrial capacity at a scale Germany could not match. Not that American vehicles were better, although they were, but that there were so many of them. An endless supply of equipment that made individual German technical superiority meaningless. The German military had encountered this problem before, but never with such clarity. In France in 1940, German tanks were individually inferior to French tanks in armor and firepower, but German tanks had radios. French tanks did not. German commanders could coordinate their forces. French commanders could not. Superior communication overcame inferior equipment. In Russia in 1941, German equipment was generally superior to Soviet equipment, but Soviet industrial capacity meant that every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable, while Soviet losses could be made good within weeks. The Jeep brought both problems together in a single package. It was individually superior to German equivalents, and it existed in such overwhelming numbers that capturing a few dozen made no practical difference. This was the reality that drove Wehrmacht officers to near desperation in their reports. They could see the problem clearly, they understood the implications, and they had absolutely no way to solve it. The pattern repeated across every theater of the war. In Italy, in France, in the Low Countries, in Germany itself. Wherever German forces encountered American units, they encountered Jeeps in numbers that seemed impossible. German intelligence estimates consistently underestimated American vehicle production by factors of 2 or 3. The actual numbers were simply beyond German comprehension. American soldiers were so numerous and so well supplied that German troops came to believe each American soldier was issued his own personal Jeep. This was obviously false, but the perception reflected a deeper truth. The abundance of American equipment was so overwhelming that it appeared limitless to soldiers whose own armies moved primarily on foot or by horse-drawn wagon.
The operation required 100 captured American Jeeps. Skorzeny had received approximately 30. He had requested 15 American tanks. He received 2, one of which broke down before the offensive began. He asked for 3,300 soldiers total. He got 2,500, of whom only 10 spoke fluent American English with knowledge of American idioms. Another 30 to 40 spoke English well, but with no knowledge of slang. 120 to 150 spoke English moderately well. The rest spoke little to no English. Skorzeny was one of Hitler's favorite commandos, a man who had rescued Mussolini from Italian captivity and kidnapped the son of the Hungarian regent. He was experienced, capable, and ruthless. But Operation Grafe was designed around a premise that could not be fulfilled. The Germans simply did not have enough captured American equipment to make the operation viable. Specifically, they did not have enough Jeeps. The problem was not lack of trying. Since early 1944, German forces had been ordered to capture intact American vehicles whenever possible. Special teams were assigned to recover abandoned or damaged American equipment from battlefields. Repair facilities were established to restore captured vehicles to working condition. But American Jeeps, despite being ubiquitous on the battlefield, were surprisingly difficult to capture intact. American units disabled their vehicles before abandoning them. Standing orders required removing distributor caps, draining fuel, and destroying critical engine components if retreat was necessary. American soldiers developed tactics specifically designed to deny equipment to the enemy. When abandoning a Jeep, some units would pull the pin from a fragmentation grenade, place the grenade under the driver's seat with the spoon held down by the seat cushion, and walk away. Anyone sitting in the driver's seat would trigger the grenade. Multiple German soldiers were killed or wounded this way before the tactic became known. Even when Jeeps were captured intact, keeping them running was difficult. The vehicles consumed fuel at rates German logistics could not sustain. The 60-horsepower Go Devil engine burned gasoline in quantities that shocked German supply officers, accustomed to the fuel-efficient Kübelwagen. German fuel in 1944 was often adulterated with synthetic additives that fouled American carburetors. Spare parts were non-existent. American Jeeps used different bolt sizes, different electrical standards, different tire dimensions than German vehicles. Maintaining captured Jeeps required cannibalizing other captured Jeeps for parts, which rapidly reduced the number of operational vehicles. By December 1944, despite 18 months of systematic effort to acquire American vehicles, the German military had fewer than 200 operational captured Jeeps in all of Western Europe. Of those, approximately 30 were allocated to Skorzeny's operation. The rest were scattered among various commands, most used by senior officers as personal transportation because they were more reliable and comfortable than German equivalents. Skorzeny launched his operation anyway. Approximately 150 German soldiers organized into small teams were assigned to infiltrate American lines. The English-speaking commandos drove in captured American Jeeps, wore American uniforms over their German uniforms as required by international law, carried American weapons, and had forged American identification papers. Their mission was to spread confusion, cut communication lines, redirect traffic, change road signs, and reconnoiter routes to the Meuse bridges. The operation achieved modest success for approximately 48 hours. German teams successfully misdirected some American units, cut telephone cables, changed road signs, and gathered intelligence on American positions. But the fundamental flaw in the operation quickly became apparent. There were so many actual American jeeps on the roads that German imposters blended into normal traffic. However, American military police became suspicious of unusual patterns. Skorzeny had made a critical error in planning. He assumed American jeeps normally carried 4 soldiers, because German vehicles normally carried 4 soldiers.
In fact, American practice was to assign 2 or occasionally 3 men per jeep. 4 was unusual. Once American counterintelligence identified this pattern, every jeep with 4 occupants became suspect. Multiple German teams were stopped, questioned, and captured because of this detail. The captured Germans revealed the operation under interrogation. Within 72 hours, American forces throughout the Ardennes were on high alert for German infiltrators. Roadblocks multiplied. Password challenges became constant. Military police questioned drivers about American culture and slang. The paranoia spread beyond actual threats. American soldiers began shooting at other American soldiers who gave incorrect answers to impromptu quiz questions about baseball or movie stars. General Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters for several days because of concerns about assassination attempts. 3 members of Skorzany's teams were captured near Awale, Belgium on December 17, 1944. Oberfenric Gunther Billing, Gerteit Wilhelm Schmidt, and Unteroffizier Manfred Paris were found carrying Wehrmacht paybooks, wearing German uniforms under their American uniforms, possessing forged American papers, and carrying both American and British weapons. They were tried by military court-martial on December 21st and executed by firing squad on December 23, 1944. Skorzany himself was wounded in the face by American artillery on December 21st and evacuated from the front. Panzer Brigade 150 was used as a conventional combat unit and suffered heavy casualties attacking Malmy. The operation was a complete failure in terms of its stated objectives. Not a single Meuse bridge was captured or even reached. The secondary objective of spreading confusion succeeded briefly, but ultimately had no significant impact on the battle. After the war, Skorzany was tried for war crimes related to Operation Greif. The specific charge was improper use of enemy uniforms, a violation of the Hague Convention. Skorzany's defense argued that wearing enemy uniforms for deception was legal, as long as the uniforms were removed before combat. A key defense witness was FFO Thomas, a former British Special Operations executive agent who testified that he and his operatives wore German uniforms behind enemy lines. Skorzany was acquitted on all charges in September 1947. He subsequently escaped from an internment camp in July 1948 with help from former SS officers. The failure of Operation Greif highlighted a problem that German commanders had struggled with throughout the war. American logistics were so overwhelming that even when German forces successfully infiltrated American lines or captured American equipment, the sheer quantity of American material made it impossible to blend in or sustain operations. The 30 jeeps Skorzany had were insignificant compared to the thousands of actual American jeeps operating in the same area. German impostures were drops of ink in an ocean of genuine American vehicles. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the war in Western Europe after 1944. Germany was fighting with carefully husbanded resources against an opponent with effectively unlimited supplies. Every German vehicle was precious, tracked in detailed inventories, maintained as long as possible. American vehicles were disposable. When a Jeep broke down, American mechanics often simply abandoned it and requisitioned a replacement. The bureaucracy to track and replace a $649 vehicle was not worth the effort. German prisoners of war captured in 1945 consistently reported shock at American wastefulness. They watched American soldiers discard equipment that German soldiers would have carefully preserved. Worn boots replaced instead of repaired. Damaged tools thrown away instead of fixed. Jeeps with minor mechanical problems pushed to the side of roads and abandoned. For German soldiers who had spent years making do with inadequate supplies, fighting with worn equipment, and cannibalizing broken vehicles for parts, the American abundance was incomprehensible. The Jeep became the symbol of this disparity. It was not the most powerful American weapon, not the most advanced, not the most feared,
but it was the most visible. German soldiers saw jeeps everywhere, all the time, in numbers that made no sense to men whose armies moved primarily on foot or by railway. The presence of jeeps meant American logistics were functioning. Where there were jeeps, there was fuel, there was supplies, there was organization. German tactical planning in Western Europe after D-Day increasingly revolved around this reality. Attacking American positions meant not just facing American infantry and armor, but American mobility. Cutting off American units was nearly impossible because they could relocate faster than German forces could encircle them. Disrupting American supply lines achieved little because American logistics had so much redundancy that losing a few trucks or jeeps made no practical difference. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzerlehr Division, later wrote detailed accounts of fighting the Americans in France for the United States Army Historical Division.
His manuscripts described how American units at every level, from platoon to division, had organic transportation that let them respond to changing situations in minutes rather than hours. German units, even elite panzer divisions, could not match this flexibility because their logistics trains were too cumbersome and their light vehicles too few and too fragile. The Volkswagen Kübelwagen was a good vehicle for its intended purpose, light reconnaissance and liaison work in areas with good roads or firm terrain. But it could not match the Jeep's performance in rough conditions, could not carry the same loads, could not tow artillery pieces, could not ford deep water. German soldiers who had experience with both vehicles universally preferred the Jeep despite its higher fuel consumption. American military intelligence was aware of German interest in captured Jeeps. Reports from interrogated prisoners consistently mentioned German units seeking to acquire and use American vehicles. In November 1943, the United States War Department issued Technical Manual TME 9803, a complete technical description of the German Kübelwagen. The manual was dated June 6, 1944, D-Day. The timing was likely coincidental, but the purpose was clear. The manual was intended for American troops who might encounter abandoned German vehicles after the Normandy invasion and want to use them. The manual's assessment was blunt. The Volkswagen Kübelwagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. This assessment was reiterated in the War Department's Technical Manual TME 3451, Handbook on German Military Forces, published in March 1945. British engineers who examined captured Kübelwagens reached similar conclusions. A report from the Humber Car Company stated the vehicle exhibited no special brilliance in design and suggested it was not to be regarded as an example of first-class modern design to be copied by British industry. These assessments were not entirely fair. The Kübelwagen was designed to different specifications than the Jeep, optimized for different priorities. It was lighter at 725 kilograms empty, compared to the Jeep's 1,113 kilograms. This made it easier for crews to manhandle if stuck. It had better fuel economy, important for an army chronically short of petroleum. The air-cooled engine required no radiator, eliminating a vulnerable component and reducing maintenance. The flat, smooth underbody allowed it to slide over obstacles that might snag vehicles with more complex suspensions. But in practical combat use, these advantages were outweighed by the Jeep's raw capability. Four-wheel drive versus 2. 60 horsepower versus 23.5. Higher ground clearance, better approach and departure angles, stronger frame and suspension. The Jeep could go places the Kübelwagen could not. Carry loads the Kübelwagen could not. Tow equipment the Kübelwagen could not. More importantly, the Jeep was available in quantities that made the comparison academic. By the end of the war, more than 640,000 Jeeps had been produced. They served on every front, in every climate, under every condition. They operated in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Pacific, the mud of Northern Europe, the snow of the Ardennes. They carried troops, supplies, ammunition, wounded soldiers, radio equipment, commanders and staff officers. They towed artillery pieces, trailers, and small aircraft. They were modified into ambulances, reconnaissance vehicles, weapons carriers, and fire trucks. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, later identified what he considered the most vital pieces of equipment to Allied success. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948,
He wrote that most senior officers came to regard 4 pieces of equipment as among the most vital to success in Africa and Europe: the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Notably, all 4 were logistics platforms, not weapons. Eisenhower understood what many historians would later overlook. Modern industrial warfare was won by logistics, not tactics.
The side that could move more men and material to the right place at the right time would win. The Jeep was the smallest but most numerous component of American logistic superiority. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied occupation forces found thousands of captured American vehicles in German hands. Many had been repainted with German markings. Some had been modified with armor or weapons. A few had been carefully maintained and were still in excellent condition. Most showed signs of hard use and inadequate maintenance, run on poor fuel with improvised repairs. The most remarkable discovery was not the number of captured vehicles, but the documented German efforts to reverse engineer the Jeep and produce a domestic copy. In late 1944, with Germany's industrial capacity collapsing under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht had initiated a program to develop a German equivalent to the Jeep. Engineers at Volkswagen were tasked with designing a 4-wheel drive version of the Kübelwagen that could match the Jeep's performance. Prototypes were built and tested. The vehicle used Kübelwagen chassis and body components combined with a more powerful engine and a 4-wheel drive system adapted from captured American examples. The prototypes reportedly performed well in testing, but by the time development was complete in early 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. The program was abandoned when Allied forces overran the Volkswagen factory in April 1945. After the war, the Jeep's influence on military vehicle design was profound and lasting. The Soviet Union had received thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease during the war. Soviet engineers studied these vehicles closely. In 1941, before significant Lend-Lease deliveries, Soviet designers had already begun work on their own light vehicle based on newspaper photographs of American prototypes. The result was the GAZ-64, which entered production in March 1941. This was later developed into the GAZ-67, incorporating design improvements learned from studying Lend-Lease Jeeps. The GAZ-67 served throughout the Cold War and influenced subsequent Soviet military vehicle development. France produced the Delahaye VLR. Italy produced the Fiat Campanola. Japan developed the Toyota Land Cruiser and Nissan Patrol, both directly inspired by Jeeps encountered during and after the war. Even Germany, when it began rebuilding its military in the 1950s, designed its light tactical vehicles with clear influence from Jeep principles. The United States Army continued using Jeeps in Korea and beyond, eventually replacing them with the M38 and M38R1, which were evolutionary developments rather than entirely new designs. The basic concept remained unchanged: light, versatile, 4-wheel drive, robust enough to survive combat conditions, simple enough to be maintained in the field. The civilian market for Jeeps was equally significant. Willys began producing civilian versions in 1945. The CJ-2A, for Civilian Jeep Model 2A, was essentially a military Jeep without the blackout lights and pioneer tools. It found immediate acceptance among farmers, ranchers, construction workers, and anyone who needed a vehicle that could go anywhere. The design evolved, but the basic concept persisted through decades and multiple corporate owners. Otto Skorsany died in Madrid, Spain on July 5, 1975. He had fled to Spain after escaping internment and settled there under Franco's protection. He occasionally gave interviews about his wartime experiences. When asked about Operation Greif, he consistently stated that the operation was doomed from the start, not because of flaws in planning or execution, but because the Germans simply did not have the material resources to compete with American logistics. He specifically cited the shortage of captured Jeeps as evidence of the broader problem. The Americans had so many that capturing them should have been easy.
Yet even systematic efforts over 18 months yielded fewer than 200 operational vehicles. Fritz Bowline survived the war and contributed extensively to the United States Army's historical program. Between 1945 and 1954, he authored approximately 20 detailed manuscripts about Wehrmacht operations in Normandy, the Ardennes, and other campaigns. His accounts consistently emphasize the impact of American material superiority, particularly mobility and logistics. Bowline died in Germany in 1970. That is how the Jeep became the most admired piece of American equipment among German soldiers, not through firepower or technological innovation, but through reliable utility available in unlimited quantities. It was everywhere, it worked, and there was always another one. The vehicle itself was unremarkable, but what it represented was revolutionary. An army that could afford to treat a sophisticated mechanical vehicle as a disposable commodity, industrial capacity so vast that individual losses were statistically invisible. That was the force that defeated Germany. Not better soldiers or better generals, but better logistics, built on an industrial foundation that could produce 640,000 identical vehicles in 4 years, while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, ships, and everything else an army needed. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.